started. So firstly, I would like to acknowledge that the seminar is being held on the traditional lands of the Gubbi people. We pay respects to elders past, present and emerging and acknowledge their connection to country and the role in their caring for and maintaining country over thousands of years. Secondly, I want to welcome everyone to the Pacific Seminar Series with the Australian Centre for Pacific Island Research. So my name is Melanie Harris and I and Brittany McGarry will be hosting the seminar for you. So today we are fortunate to have two inspiring women showing their gender inclusive ways to make an impact in the Pacific Islands fisheries presenting to you, Salote and Sheridan. So first up we have Salote, who is an aquaculture scientist based in Fiji. Her research includes population genetics, shrimp viral diseases, aquatic biosecurity and agribusiness within aquaculture. Salote is a research scientist for Pacific Agribusiness Research and Development Initiative and helped establish the Tilapia Farmers Association. Salote's presentation is titled Agribusiness Development for Women in Aquaculture in Fiji. So in Fiji, most aquaculture value chains lack market-driven, private sector-led attitudes and initiatives to see notable commercial growth. Decades of national effort have seen tilapia fish excel as a food security product, yet remain limited as a serious source of livelihood for smallholder farmers. Women tilapia farmers currently make 15 to 20% of active semi-commercial producers. So Salote will discuss the key areas for development of women in tilapia aquaculture with efforts to encourage more participation and decision-making equity. So throughout the seminar, if you have any questions for our presenters, please pop them into the chat and we'll allow some time at the end to answer them. And without taking any more time up, I'll pass you over to Salote.
Thanks very much, Melanie, and bula everyone. And this is the first time I'm presenting to ACPIR, so I'm excited. There's a few of you who are in the room that I know, and some others that I hope to make connections with soon. So I've already been introduced, but I'd just like to say Mbulubinaka again to everyone, and a bit of background about me. I'm from Fiji. I'm from Lau, from one of the 14 provinces in Fiji. And I went to school. I went to university at University of the South Pacific, and I think Professor Pedinan is here. So I'm familiar with some of the staff that are sitting here in the room that used to be at USP. My background's in marine science, and the two species that I've focused a lot on in my research for aquaculture has been around black tiger shrimp, Penaeus monodon, and Nile tilapia fish, or Oreochromis niloticus. So that map there of Fiji, the main island, Viti Levu, my area of work is anywhere between Suva and Nandi at the moment for my agribusiness research. So I'm currently the research scientist for this project, which is an ACR funded project, Pacific Agribusiness Research and Development Initiative. And the main aim for this project, which recently just ended also in November last year, the main aim is to identify and understand how agribusiness development opportunities can contribute to improved economic growth and livelihoods in the Pacific Islands. So I've just got there a few photos of a wide variety of activities and enterprises that we've engaged with. And these are farmers and enterprises in agriculture, such as beekeepers, cover farmers, papaya farmers, breadfruit farmers, and also a little bit of fisheries, in the fisheries space, particularly with tilapia farmers. So the area of work that I've been involved in is strengthening the value chain. So agribusiness research, the approach that we're taking in this project is taking a look at the value chain for each of these, for various commodities, and seeing where there are weak points of the value chain and how they can be improved. So I've just got a slide there about what a value chain is, and it's basically the movement of product and also value of agriculture and fisheries products from the production end to the market end. So there are main actors along the value chain, and these are everyone that's responsible for the movement of products from one end to the other. And there are also support actors, so people that may not be directly involved with the chain, but help to promote and enable the environment for movement. So for example, government, other developmental agencies, the public. So this is basically the approach that we've taken for our agribusiness research, is to look at the value chain, find out where there are weak links, and try and improve it. Since my background is in aquaculture, I was tasked in this project to focus on tilapia. And tilapia is a freshwater fish, but I'll get into that in the next slide. This is just an overview of aquaculture in the Pacific and in Fiji. Aquaculture is it's a fledgling industry in the Pacific, usually described as small and underdeveloped for most countries compared to agriculture. And in Fiji, aquaculture, or the farming of aquatic species and the culturing of aquatic species, began in the 1940s as a response to the agriculture sector. So some species were brought in as feed to serve the agriculture sector. But in the 1970s, there was a bit more government investment in fish, in tilapia production specifically. So really over the last decades, there's been a few developments, and to the point where in the Pacific, in the early 2000s, SPC had identified during one of their studies that there are actually five commodities that form the basis for a viable aquaculture business, and so these are pearl oysters, tilapia fish, which is a freshwater fish. You've got prawns, Capophycus, seaweed. So the issue here, though, is that most of these are invasive species. These are species that are not native or endemic to Fiji. Most of them have been introduced. So that's also an issue for conservation. So why is tilapia fish farming supported in Fiji, particularly from government? Tilapia globally is a well-researched, fast-growing, and reasonably affordable fish to farm. However, most of the industry is extremely fragmented, so most of the producers are made up of many small-scale farmers. In Fiji, the government has included tilapia as part of their aquaculture plan, and is also developing their national plan to include the production and commercial development of aquaculture. But the reality too is that in Fiji and in most parts of the Pacific, we are experiencing climate change. We are experiencing overfishing, and there is an increased need for affordable, accessible, and healthy sources of protein. So coupled with population increase, we hope that we can ease the pressure on our fisheries by being able to produce an affordable and alternative source of protein like tilapia. So in Fiji, this is just a brief history of tilapia in Fiji. There's about 500 farms, and mostly smallholder farmers. And there's this, as I mentioned before, this strong government lead. There are research stations that are set up to carry out production research. for tilapia, and the government has a food security program which is very popular among smallholder farmers. And in the just probably over the last 5 years, there has been a lot more interest in the commercial space, particularly with our previous government that was interested in enterprise development. So there's more private hatcheries, 2 private hatcheries that have, well, 1 major private hatchery that is developed. And through this project, the need for a private sector lead in industry development was seen. So, and that's led to the formation of the Tilapia Farmers Associations. So that's something that I'll cover in this presentation. Since I'm going to be talking particularly around women in tilapia farming, or women in tilapia aquaculture, there are different farm modalities of women participating in tilapia activities or tilapia aquaculture activities. So there are, so when I mean farm modalities, the way farms are run by women. So some farms are run like, as in community-based, they're run by committees. And the committees can either be led by males or females. Some are led by either male or female-headed household farms. There are also single male-headed household farms, which are family-run, and then we also have husband and wife team farms. So there are different ways, or different ways of women being visible in their tilapia aquaculture activities. And this information was gathered from SPC. They had done a gender analysis study, one of the very few and probably the only gender analysis study that's been done for tilapia aquaculture in Fiji, which was done in 2018. So a lot of the gender space in tilapia aquaculture is quite recent. So I'm going to move on now to the Tilapia Fiji Farmers Association. So part of the project involved bringing stakeholders together to just talk about what are the current issues and needs for the tilapia industry. And so we brought stakeholders together from Ministry of Fisheries, SPC, our project, to talk about key issues. And some of the needs that were brought up were the need for closer coordination among stakeholders, the need for quality seed stock, and particularly business skills, capital, and a need for the visibility of private sector-led initiatives. So during that meet, one of the major outcomes was the formation of the Tilapia Fiji Association in 2019. And then COVID hit. So that was an issue. So this is the current model, well, a model structure of the association. I won't go too much into this, but basically, I'll show you in the next slide. This is the current structure. So we have clusters, and the idea is to partner with other organizations to be able to move our activities forward. So these are the current office bearers. We have three women, which is encouraging, because this is an official national association of farmers, of which 3 women as office bearers is quite encouraging. And we have 3 cluster reps. So these are where our reps, where our clusters of farmers exist, in the central cluster, the western cluster, and northern cluster. And the number of farmers per cluster are about 20 to 25 within each area. Some of the key developments that the association has tried to involve women in, because the important thing for us is that they're visible, they're vocal, and that they're valued, is to, and we've tried to implement that at the executive level, so making sure that there are women that are represented at the executive, in executive boards, that women are being allowed to contribute during meets with government. So we've had meetings with the Permanent Secretary and Ministry of Fisheries around strategic partnerships and development, making sure that our women are visible during market demonstrations or when we have market days. So the association would represent a number of farmers in selling their fish at this is small scale level, or also making sure that women are seen even in public in the media. So we had a Green Pillars TV episode where we had some of our female farmers speaking about their experience and talking about the effects of COVID. Stakeholder engagement, so women speaking at forums and also being able to have their voices heard around research priorities. We've also had value chain training in which we've really tried to include not only women farmers, but also women researchers, so supporting actors along the value chain. There's a strong need for sex aggregated data in aquaculture. So despite our development, despite our activities to include women in a variety of value chain activities, there's still a very limited amount of sex aggregated data. And if there's no such data, it means there's no visibility, there's no value. Strategic partnerships need to be aligned to government food security programs, which are gender specific or gender sensitive. So these are some limitations. In contrast to capture fisheries, which is a photo there, we need a lot more effort in collecting gender specific data. So there's still a lot of limited information that's available. There's a need for technical training for women, and particularly in communities. And so there's a clash of gender roles, a lack of recognition for their work, which means they're undervalued and unrecognized. This is my second last slide. So opportunities, there are opportunities though, despite the lack of training and data and really strategic partnerships. There are opportunities such as accelerator programs and formal training that women can be part of. And that's a picture there at the top with our president, who was part of an incubator program. And she's gone through a lot of, that was a 6-month program. So there are programs out there that focus on just women in business. And finally, a major recommendation for us as an association moving forward is to make sure that we have a well-represented executive team. We've had a few that have fallen off the grid, especially after COVID, but we're having our next meeting next week. So there's 2 or 3 women that have said yes to their positions. We hope to have the association strategic plan up and shared with other stakeholders, and to have gender sensitive governance systems and sustainability, strategic partnerships for gender sensitive data collection, data management, and data sharing, and hopefully with the support of other stakeholders, develop or pilot an agribusiness incubator model. And all of this having a gender lens. So this is all I've got to share with us this afternoon. Open to any questions.
Thank you, Salote. That was really interesting. Yeah, so we're just going to open up for any questions if anyone has any.
There's nothing come through in the chat at the moment, but
actually, Salote, I was just going to ask. Sorry, so when the tilapia farms are in sort of more rural areas, are they for just the village, like community use, or are they commercial?
most of the tilapia farms in Fiji are community-based. There's a very small amount, like less than 30% of farms that are commercial, semi-commercial to commercial. So most of the women are, and this is very similar to, I was involved in a study with women in capture fisheries, where women were involved in fisheries activities was not for commercial reasons, but for subsistence and supporting their families. So it's the same thing here. We've got a lot of women that are focused a lot on community based farms, but the association is came out as a private sector or industry driven group. So what we'd like to do is we'd like to promote or we'd like to help smallholder farmers that are interested to enter semi-commercial, commercial level. So having these women enter, the relevant business training is good, but most of them are community-based, just looking after their families and communities.
Awesome. We do have a question online, Salote. I'll read it for you if you can't see. Maybe you can see the question in the chat, but Maxwell Stevens asked, is it ever difficult to survey fisheries in isolated areas? And are the surveys based off physical observation or voluntary input? Maxwell's interested if there could be any manipulation of the input responses.
For aquaculture, and particularly around the association, we are privy only to the information that our farmers give us. And that's actually just around production and production standards. But when it comes to actually doing survey work where we go out to collect data as an association, this is very new for us because we formed in 2019, and then 2020, 2021 was COVID. And then we tried to do a project in late 2021. So in terms of data collection for the association, we don't have that sort of data. But for fisheries, though, Ministry of Fisheries does have that sort of data, and accessibility to communities is a big issue. And also having enough extension officers to be able to collect data is important. I've had experience collecting data for women in capture fisheries, and most of the data was collected by just interviews, because their activities involved having to go out like beyond the reef to do their capture fisheries activities. So most of it is voluntary, but there still is I think accessibility to actually go and see these farmers is an issue, especially if the roads aren't good roads.
If anyone wants to ask any questions, you're more than welcome to ask in person. If you don't want to put it in the chat, you can put your camera on and speak to Salote in person if you would like to. So just asking if there's any more questions.
I have a question for you, Salote. How did you get to be in this position in your career? Like, did you always set out to be an aquaculture scientist? Is this something that you have evolved into, or as a child, this was the direction that you wanted to grow up and be a leader in your field?
I got into marine science because I was told to do something in the ocean, to do something that had to do with fisheries, and that's because the belief was we have more ocean than land. So how I got into aquaculture was really through it was just I think we were given an activity during one of our aquaculture courses, and I ended up just pursuing that particular topic around aquatic animal health. But agribusiness isn't a field of mine, but I've worked with aquaculture farms. So I work in a really supportive team of agribusiness researchers, and I've learned a lot. But this in Fiji, and particularly in most parts of the Pacific, in industrial associations is for agriculture and fisheries based groups is novel. So one of the issues for us is governance. Like how do you develop successfully a industrial association that's made up of smallholder farmers? So definitely we are looking for for key partnerships where capacity building is around governance, around becoming a strong industry, particularly now as our government is a new government. The voices of unions and collective action is more visible now as compared to our last government. So it's timely for us. So hopefully we'll make good partners for capacity building.
Great, thanks, Salote.
Awesome. Yeah. So thank you. Yeah, so we're almost out of time and ready to I want to thank you very much, but we'll have a chat to you towards the end as well. So I'd like to thank you, Salote, and I'm going to hand over to Brittany now, so as we move on to our second presenter.
Thanks, Mel. Today's Pacific seminar speaker to follow Salote is Sheridan Rabbitt. She's a marine social scientist working on gender and nutrition sensitive approaches to community-based fisheries management in the Pacific. Sheridan's worked in marine education and as a consultant to the World Fish Centre in the Solomon Islands. Sheridan recently submitted her PhD focused on the understanding of women in small-scale fisheries in the Solomon Islands. Sheridan's presentation is called A Framework for Assessing Women's Engagement in Community-Based Fisheries Management in the Pacific, using a case study from Morovo Lagoon, Solomon Islands. Sheridan will be speaking about a case study of 3 communities where they adapted a communities-based fisheries management framework to present a participation model for assessing gender inclusivity. The results show that gender parity is not a reliable indicator of gender equity, and that women's engagement in community-based fisheries management decision-making varies significantly between communities. Please, we'll let you launch in. Thanks, Sheridan. Yes.
Yes. Okay, cool. Hopefully. Let me know if there's any issues with the slides, but hopefully we're all good. So thank you so much for that introduction. I won't reintroduce myself, but I will talk a little bit today about this model that we have been testing to look at how we can assess women's engagement in community-based fisheries management in the Pacific, using a case study from 3 communities in the Solomons. The slides don't want to change anymore. Why can't I change? Is that changing for you guys now?
Yes.
Okay, I can only use one screen. All right. So I'm just going to talk really briefly about why we care about fisheries management, but from a human perspective, because I think people talk a lot about fisheries management from an environmental perspective, which is great, but it's just not my area. So small scale fisheries, or SSFs, are actually really, really important. They support the livelihoods of quite literally hundreds of thousands of people all over the world. And in a lot of our rural coastal communities in the Pacific, they're hugely important for nutrition, and they're really the cornerstone of a lot of these local economies as well. So about 90 to 95% of that catch is getting consumed locally. So it's really important we manage those resources well, not from an environmental perspective, but also from a human health perspective. We are finally slowly starting to realize that fisheries are socio-ecological systems. And what this means is that fisheries management is actually about managing human behavior, because fish do not care where our protected areas are. They don't care what management actions we have put in. The people who care are the fishers. So we really need our fishers to be on board with our management actions if we want them to succeed. But we do know that whether people comply with management actions and how they comply is really largely driven by a whole range of quite complex social, cultural, and economic factors. And because they're complex, they're either completely ignored or very poorly included in management plans, which is a bit of an issue. We're seeing this increasing emphasis on actually incorporating our resource users into our decision-making processes so that we get that buy-in. But what we're forgetting is that everyone is not being included in the same way, and all of the perspectives are not valued equally. These issues are pretty common across all of natural resource management, but in fisheries management in particular, the exclusion of women is really well documented. And a lot of it comes down to this very persistent myth that fisheries is a male domain. Despite all the evidence to the contrary, we're still battling with this decades-old myth that fisheries is a male thing and women aren't involved. So in the Pacific Islands, women are really heavily involved in fisheries. They play many roles in a whole range of fisheries value chains. So they're involved in harvest of fish and invertebrates. They're processing seafood, they're marketing seafood, and they're also involved in a lot of what we would call fishery adjacent activities. So things like account keeping, net mending, stuff that keeps fisheries ticking over. We also know at least 50% of the small scale catch of fisheries in the Pacific is by women. So they are very heavily involved in fisheries harvest. They're also making up the majority of our market vendors. For Melanesia, women are contributing around 80% of their community's subsistence needs. So as Salote has said, women are really heavily involved in providing food for their families and their communities. Interestingly, they're also quite visible in the commercial sector, perhaps a little bit more than the subsistence sector. And this sort of comes down to just the fact that we've got actual employment data for the commercial sector. So for example, Sol Tuna, which is a tuna cannery in Noro in the Solomon Islands, we know that over 2/3 of their staff are women. So without women, that cannery wouldn't actually function. So we know they're really involved. Really important to note that women do actually fish in different ways to men. So we know they have different spatial patterns of fishing. They utilize different habitats, different resources, and different ways of fishing as well. So if we're not including women in our decision-making processes, we're missing a big part of the picture of fisheries harvest and fisheries management. So community-based fisheries management is what I work on. It's a very popular tool in the Pacific for fisheries management. Partly this is because it builds on existing traditional ways of managing fisheries in the Pacific. It's also very well suited to the land tenure situation in much of the Pacific as well, which is another reason it's quite popular. We're hearing more and more about CBFM because there's been a lot of pushback on top-down management processes. But this community-based or community-focused does not actually mean that everyone is being included in the same way. It's not actually inclusive by design, which is what people tend to think when they think of CBFM. In the Solomon Islands context, CBFM is actually written into the National Fisheries Policy as being the most effective way of managing their coastal fisheries. And again, that largely comes down to the fact that the land tenure situation in the Solomons is it is such that most land is still under customary tenureship. So therefore, those coastal fisheries are really best managed at a local level by the communities that own those resources. There's well over 300 communities engaged in some form of CBFM. A lot of them are in co-management arrangements, so often with an NGO. And a lot of these communities have some sort of management committee, sometimes a council of elders, and often a group of rangers as well, because there is a National Rangers Association. Probably the most commonly employed tool in CBFM is the tambu site, which tambu means closed generally. They're usually some form of periodically harvested closure. But it's important to note that the length of closure varies quite markedly between communities, and it's often quite poorly aligned with the life history strategies of the target species as well. So I've been working in these 3 very beautiful communities in Morovo Lagoon, so very fortunate. And Morovo Lagoon is here. I'm not sure which screen you can see, hopefully this one. It's in the Western Province here. And working on these 3 communities in Whanganui-Gatakai and Morovo Island. I do not have time to go over this table in much detail, so I'm going to skim through it. Please feel free to ask me questions at the end. I just wanted to highlight that the 3 communities that I've been working in are actually quite different. So they have very different demographic and geographic factors. And this is intentional in my study design because it does impact how women can engage with CBFM. Very quickly, communities 1 and 2 are located on the weather coast. So they are on the open ocean facing side of the lagoon. So they're exposed to quite rough conditions. Whereas community 3 is in a very sheltered lagoonal area. Communities 1 and 2 have basically no access to reliable maritime transport services and therefore no access to larger markets outside of their communities. Whereas community 3 does have very good access. Communities 1 and 2 are quite a bit smaller than community 3, which is obviously about double the size. And all 3 of the communities do have some form of periodically harvested closure, although they vary quite a bit between the 3 communities as to their size and how they're managed. Lastly, communities 1 and 3 are both United Church is their dominant religion, whereas community 2 is Seventh-day Adventist. And this is really important because Seventh-day Adventists aren't able to consume fish without scales. So that means they're not eating shellfish and they're not eating sharks and rays. So it does actually impact how women are engaging with fisheries and therefore with CBFM. Feel free to ask me more questions later. So how do we pull together this model? I went out into the communities to do a bunch of focus group discussions, which is what you can see in the photo here. And I really just wanted to understand women's experiences with CBFM in their communities. What did they think about how it was working? Particularly, what did they think about the actual decision-making mechanism? So in most cases, that was a committee. In one community, there was also a council of elders involved. And in all 3 communities, there was a ranger group that were doing enforcement of the management actions. So I really wanted to know what they thought about those processes. We also recorded details of the committee membership and the ranger group membership. So took the names and whether they were male or female to look at the gender breakdown. And then also looked within the committees at the leadership positions and whether women were holding any of those leadership roles. When we pulled all of those data together, we were able to adapt an existing framework that Bina Agarwal had developed for a Southeast Asian forestry context, and then make it very specific to a Melanesian CBFM context. So we've ended up with these 6 stages of framework, starting from at the very bottom, a place of complete exclusion. Now, we did not see this in the communities that we were working in, but we do know that it happens in other communities in the Solomons and probably in other parts of the Pacific as well. So it is an important baseline for our framework. As you move up the framework, you're seeing increasing levels of women's engagement and participation. By the time you hit the top, the gold star, the interactive or empowering level, what you're seeing then is that women aren't just on the committee, but they're actively participating in the meetings. Their ideas are being valued and they're being debated equally in the same way that men's ideas would be. Importantly, they're also holding roles, like specific roles, so generally leadership roles that then impact women's power and influence within the community more broadly. So these are the 3 communities that we assessed. So our first community, community 1, is pretty high actually, which is really great news. So they came out as active participation, so very close to the top. So what you can see there is there's quite a number of women on the management committee. There's 1 woman holding a leadership role, and there's a few women in the Rangers group as well. When we got into the focus groups for this community, the women were so enthusiastic about their roles in CBFM. They felt so included. They were talking about how they were actively involved in monitoring. They were actively involved in decisions about whether to open or close a tambu site, which was all really, really lovely to hear. And really interestingly, in this village, there was very, very strong support from both religious leaders as well as other village leaders for women's engagement in CBFM. And we think that's probably contributing to this, this community being quite high on the framework. For community 2, unfortunately, it's a bit of a different story. And I just want to flag this figure here, this 43%, because a lot of what people do at the moment when they do gender work is they count the number of women that are engaged. And so you get this figure. And from this figure, you might say, great, near equal representation, women are included. Once we got into the focus groups, this is not at all what was happening in this community. They were saying, well, the men make the decisions, they come to us, they tell us they've made a decision and they expect us to support it. So these women were not engaged at all. They weren't included. And that's why we've ended up with this very passive participation for this community, which is quite unfortunate. Community 3 is a bit of an interesting one. It was a bit of a mix. So it was sort of part passive participation and part consultative. Again, quite a high number of women actually on the committee. 1 of the 4 leadership roles was held by a woman as well. And we also have 1 female ranger in this community. When we got into the focus groups, the women in this community really felt that they weren't being consulted, they weren't being included. They felt that a lot of conversations were happening around the village without them. And they, interestingly, they kind of expressed that they didn't feel that CBFM was really for them. They wanted to be a part of it, but they didn't see where the opportunities were for women to be more engaged in this process. And they expressed a lot of frustration about a particular management decision around the implementation of one tambu site, which ended up being put in a women's fishing ground because women hadn't been consulted. And a lot of the women in the focus groups were telling us that they'd actually been fishing in the tambu site since it had been closed because they were so frustrated with the decision-making process. And there's similar examples of this in other parts of the Solomons as well. So not necessarily great news for Community 3 either. So we learned some really interesting lessons while we were doing this work. As I just showed, there was quite a lot of women actually on the committees, which is a really positive first step, but it's not necessarily translating to us seeing increased numbers of women actually being engaged in the decision-making process. Maybe this is because there weren't very many women holding the leadership roles, but it could also just come down to the fact that there is a sort of pervasive culture of silence in fisheries management in the Pacific, where women's voices just aren't valued in the same way that men's voices are. Again, as was expressed in Community 3, there was this sort of sense that CBFM as a structure was not really built for women, it was built for men, and they weren't really feeling that it was particularly welcoming towards them or that it really suited them. I did want to touch on quotas because if anyone's read any of the literature around women's engagement in community-based fisheries management, you'll know that there are some papers out there that really push for the use of quotas, and we've seen it obviously in politics and a few other places as well. Our research does not support the use of quotas, and I personally think that it's not particularly useful at all because it glazes over the nuances. Women are not a homogenous group. We are all obviously very different. There's a lot of intersectionality of other factors, so a woman's age, her status, whether she's an insider or outsider in that community, her ethnicity, all of these other factors actually interact together to enable how a woman is able to contribute to community-based fisheries management. And if we just put in quotas, we're missing the nuance that all women are different and they're engaging in different ways. So there's really no one-size-fits-all approach to CBFM that's actually going to work. As with other research, gender parity is not the same as gender equity. I know a lot of other people have said this, but the reason I really wanted to stress this point is that a lot of the government and NGO groups working in this space are still using gender parity as a bit of a yardstick measure, I guess. And they're sort of counting things like the number of women on committees, the number of women in meetings, the number of women talking in meetings. But we're missing the fact that gender parity is not actually telling us much about engagement. It's just telling us the number of women there. It's not actually translating to whether or not they're engaged or how their voices are being valued. So it's not an overly useful measure. I do still think it's very important, of course, that we increase the number of women on committees, but we do need to consider whether those women are actually a diverse representation of their whole community or just a subsection of women in their community. Community 3 was a really nice example of what happens when you don't consult people. They push back, they don't want to be part of your management action, and they don't want to follow your rules. So again, a really nice example that we should be involving all of the resource user groups in our management, not just some of them. Also, as I flagged earlier, local community context matters, and that includes things like demographic and geographic factors. They actually have a role to play in how women engage with CBFM, so it is worth making sure we do a bit more work on that. Just some recommendations we put together for fisheries practitioners in particular. We need to be working towards meaningful engagement. So that's, collecting these statistics on the number of women involved is not really overly useful. What we need to be doing is challenging these underlying gender norms and actually engaging with the gender power structures that are enabling or platforming men's voices over women. I really do understand that this is challenging and it's a big ask, particularly for governments who have very limited resources, very limited budgets, and very limited time. But there just isn't a quick fix to increasing women's engagement in CBFM. It's a long process. It's going to take time and it's going to take a lot of engagement. When you're working in communities, you really need to ask the women in communities separate to the men what their needs are, what do they want to see happen in their communities, because they often think about different things to men. They've got different priorities, different aspirations. So it's worth asking them and paying close attention to what they're saying and how they're saying it in those meetings as well, because it provides important context. Again, those demographic and geographic factors are also useful for context, and it's not something being collected regularly at the moment. So it's worth adding that in and stuff getting collected. I also wanted to highlight there are some fabulous guidelines already for mainstreaming gender in fisheries, particularly the work by Kate Barclay and also the SPC. And there's some great guidelines by Danica Kleiber for facilitating gender inclusive meetings. So I'd really like to see the use of these much more mainstream than they are at the moment. And lastly, it seems obvious, but it's very hard to be the catalyst for change in communities when we haven't got our own house in order first. There's a lot of things that need to change in organisations throughout the Pacific and in Australia, of course, as well. So we need to be looking at improving our gender inclusivity and internal attitudes towards women before we can affect change at a broader scale. Very quickly, because I know I'm over time, I just want to say a big livelihood to all of the people involved in my research, particularly Betsy in this photo here, who's been an absolute pillar of my research for about 7 years now, and she's just absolutely fabulous. Thank you also to the members of the study communities that welcomed me, particularly all of the women. Can't list all of the names here, but this research wouldn't have been possible without any of them. And lastly, thank you all so much for listening.
Awesome. Thanks, Sheridan. That was really insightful. I really enjoyed hearing about the community-based fisheries management, something I haven't looked into, and nice to hear from one of the experts in the field. So let's open up to questions. Do we have anything in the chat now?
We only have some thank yous, but no questions at the moment. Does anyone have any questions for Sheridan?
I found that really interesting, the variation or the variability across the 3 different communities. Yeah, that was quite stark, wasn't it? Especially with the religious context around taking different fish from the ocean.
Yeah, actually, can I just ask, sorry, so in my research in Fiji, I found a few communities mentioned difficulty in monitoring tambu areas. So how do they do that in the Solomons? Like, are they supplied with like resources to manage them?
No, it's such a good question. And I think this is in my paper, but I can't remember now because it's been a while since I wrote it. But one of the issues I see with community-based fisheries management is that the government, at least in the Solomons context, that the government has sort of handed over the responsibility, I guess, of managing fisheries resources, coastal fisheries resources to communities, which is great because they are the resource owners, and it's really empowering for communities, obviously, to be in charge of your own resources. But they're not getting the resources to actually be supported in this process. I did a lot of work when I was working with World Fish on community-based fisheries management, and World Fish, and there's a lot of other organisations like WWF and SPC who have partnered with communities in those individual communities' management plans to help them, better manage their fisheries resources. But for all of these other communities that don't have an NGO partnered with them who visits on a semi-regular basis, there's absolutely nothing. So a lot of the communities that I worked with, a lot of them expressed not frustration, I guess, but just they were confused. Like, they don't necessarily understand the different life history strategies of all of the species. And it's very hard to, know how long your tambu closure should be if you don't know the life history strategies of the species. There's just no support. And even around enforcement is a really tricky one, because often in a community's management plan, there's a monetary fine or there's some other sort of fine when you breach the management plan rules. But that's a community finding their own community member. And there's a lot of really difficult social interactions around that. And often what happens in practice is that people just don't get fined. They just sort of ignore it and say, oh, please don't do it again. And it just keeps going like that. And it frustrates everyone. Youth in particular are very frustrated because they're thinking a lot about their future and their resources, and they're particularly frustrated, A, that they're excluded, and B, that the management is just so poor. I just don't know what the answer is, because obviously the government has very limited resources, and they can't get everywhere. There's over 900 islands in the Solomons. Over 300 of those are inhabited. They can't be everywhere. It's impractical. But we need to find a way to get more resources out to communities to help them to better manage their own resources, and look at ways to manage, to monitor tambu sites is another really tricky one, because the reason they're often in women's fishing grounds is because they put them quite close to the community so they can see them and they can monitor them. But the areas close to communities are often women's fishing grounds because they've got other priorities and they need to come back quickly for children and other reasons. And so there's a real big clash there between how do we manage sites effectively without putting them in areas that is constantly disadvantaging women and not men. So there's a lot of really difficult questions that I don't have the answers to, but I ponder them a lot.
Yes, I completely understand. I've thought that a lot too, because it's the same feedback I sort of received as well. Yeah, that I guess I was sort of, when you said not frustration, but yeah, I guess that was sort of what came across, that they didn't really know the answer, but they knew that they needed some support. But yeah.
Great. We have a question from Salote.
Oh, probably more of a comment, because I found it interesting when you said, and I share the same sentiments, that gender parity doesn't equal gender equity. And I found the same thing, like just having women on committees or having them present in the room doesn't always guarantee that, you know, their voices are going to be heard or that they're going to be valued. However, I'd helped Conservation International carry out some qualitative work around the contribution of women to their fisheries. So we had, we were separated into different provinces. So I walked around my province, Lau, particularly around my own island. And one of the things that we saw was that when women had an economic contribution, whether it be an economic contribution to the family or to her wider tribe or her village, there seemed to be a bit more importance, or her voice is a bit more important when money is involved, or when there's an economic tag there. I think that's important. That really resonated with me, because I think through some of the work that we're doing, women are finding their voices heard when they're making those economic decisions, when they're able to say, I'm able to employ people, I'm able to pay my taxes, I help pay superannuation for my workers. So I think, but having said that, doesn't mean that the contributions of women within their families are not important. But I found that it was interesting that when women had an economic impact, their voices were deemed as a bit more important.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. There's not great data for this in Morovo. A lot of the earlier research said women weren't involved at all in fishing for cash, you know, selling it off, whereas we're starting to see quite a lot of that happening now. And yeah, same sort of thing. As soon as women start bringing cash income in, suddenly they're an important player. I think this speaks to a much broader gender issue that is common across the Western world as well, that we do not value women's work. We don't value domestic work. We don't value reproductive duties, and we don't value things like cooking, keeping a household running. And again, I think that speaks to that's something we need to address on our end before we can even do anything in communities, when we know that, you know, here in the Western world, we don't value that kind of work. So it's really tricky. But yeah, I totally agree. As soon as you start attaching dollar values to things, suddenly women have a lot more value, which is horrible, but true.
Okay, if that's the end of our questions and discussion, I would like to take this moment to thank you both, Salote and Sheridan, for your insights today. And yeah, definitely for supporting our centre by sharing your projects and research. It's lovely to see a few more participants joining us for our Pacific seminar series as well. I can see some new names on our list today. If you'd like to join our mailing list to hear about upcoming seminars and events, please send us a private message in the chat. Our next Pacific seminar series in March will be with Professor Scott Power, talking about climate change, climate variability, and early warning systems in the Pacific Islands. So if you want to pop that date in the calendar, it's March 29th. Otherwise, yeah, thank you, everyone. We really enjoyed this session, and all the best. Thank you.
Thank you.